Alarms are screaming, smoke is rising from below, and you walk. Every instinct says sprint, but the rule says walk, and the rule is right. And then, 167 men died on a burning North Sea platform, and the industry finally understood why. Steel grating covers every surface on an offshore platform, slick with sea spray, oil mist, and rain. UK health and safety executive data shows slips, trips, and falls account for roughly 1/3 of all major offshore injuries every year. Running on this terrain isn't bravery, it's a medical emergency that hasn't happened yet. The offshore industry's relationship with fall prevention would later become the exact thing that defined how every life-saving rule was written and enforced. But in the years before Piper Alpha, it was just another line in a safety manual that nobody thought would be tested the way it was. Slips, trips, and falls are consistently the #1 cause of reportable offshore injuries in the UK sector. That's not a historical footnote, that's the current reality, confirmed year after year in Health and Safety Executive annual statistics. And that wasn't even the part that got people angry. The part that got people angry was the realization that running, the instinctive human response to danger, actively makes every one of those statistics worse. Physics doesn't negotiate. When you run on wet, uneven, cluttered deck surfaces, your center of gravity shifts forward. Your reaction time to surface changes collapses, and your ability to stop or redirect yourself in a narrow corridor drops to near zero. A single misstep on dry ground at walking pace is recoverable. The same misstep at a run on oil-misted steel grating is a broken leg at best, a head injury at worst, and a blocked escape route in either case. That last point is the one that changes the math entirely. A single fall during an evacuation doesn't just injure one person. It physically obstructs a narrow walkway or stairwell, and everyone behind that person is now stopped, bunched, and exposed. One fall cascades into multiple casualties. The physics of crowd movement on confined offshore escape routes means a bottleneck at a stairwell can hold up dozens of workers trying to reach a muster station. I mean, think about that for a second. One runner, one fall, an entire escape route compromised. This is precisely why operators like Shell, Equinor, and BP have embedded walk, don't run directly into their life-saving rules, positioned at the same tier of non-negotiable priority as lockout, tagout, working at height, and permit-to-work procedures. These are not suggestions. Violation of a life-saving rule is a terminable offense on most platforms. You don't get a warning, you get escorted off the installation. The offshore industry celebrated when life-saving rules became standard. They shouldn't have celebrated too early, because enforcing a rule on paper and making it hold under genuine emergency conditions are two entirely different problems. Up to this point, the industry had been building the framework. That was about to flip. Picture the North Sea on the night of July 6, 1988. The Piper Alpha platform sits 120 miles northeast of Aberdeen, producing oil and gas around the clock. At 9:45 in the evening, a condensate leak ignites. Within 2 hours, 167 men are dead. It remains the worst offshore disaster in history, a number so large it reshaped an entire global industry. The chaos of that night is almost impossible to process. Men were jumping 50 feet into a burning sea because there was no structured escape plan that they had practiced, trusted, or could execute under pressure. The muster stations were inaccessible. The communication systems failed. Workers who had never rehearsed a real evacuation were left to improvise in the dark, surrounded by fire and falling debris. Improvisation in that environment killed people. Lord William Cullen led the public inquiry that followed. His 1990 report ran to 2 volumes and made 106 recommendations. At its core, the Cullen Report identified that clear procedures, rigorous training, and disciplined mustering were absent on Piper Alpha, and that absence was not incidental, it was systemic. The industry had tolerated procedural gaps, and those gaps became the fault lines along which 167 lives were lost. Cullen's report didn't just recommend new rules, it forced a complete cultural overhaul of how offshore workers move, think, and respond under pressure. The concept of a practiced, rehearsed, disciplined evacuation where every worker walks a known route to a known muster point in a known sequence became the regulatory baseline, not an aspiration. Post-Piper Alpha, UK regulation mandated emergency response plans with explicit, practiced evacuation routes built around controlled movement, walking, not running. The distinction was no longer left to individual judgment. It was written into law, into operator safety cases, and into the induction of every worker who stepped onto a UK continental shelf installation from that point forward. Piper Alpha didn't just change the rules, it proved that without disciplined movement, rules mean nothing. On April 20, 2010, the Deepwater Horizon drilling rig was operating in the Gulf of Mexico, approximately 40 miles off the Louisiana coast. A blowout triggered an explosion that killed 11 men instantly. The rig burned for 36 hours before sinking to the seabed in 5,000 feet of water. It became the largest marine oil spill in United States history and the second great wake-up call for global offshore safety culture. This is where the story takes a turn nobody expected. Post-incident reviews didn't just expose mechanical and procedural failures in well control, they exposed gaps in mustering accountability that had been hiding in plain sight. Supervisors in the immediate aftermath of the explosion could not confirm with certainty who was where. Personnel accountability, knowing exactly which of the 126 people on board had reached safety, was compromised in the chaos. The reform response was direct. Emergency response plans were restructured around personnel walking to assigned muster stations in sequence, with headcounts conducted at every checkpoint. The walking pace wasn't about comfort, it was about accountability. A supervisor watching workers arrive at a muster station can count, identify, and report. A supervisor watching a crowd sprint past cannot do any of those things reliably. Post-incident analysis also confirmed that running created bottlenecks at stairwells and secondary injuries during the evacuation itself, injuries that complicated the rescue response and added to the burden on emergency teams. The global industry response was unambiguous. Emergency response plans now explicitly state that personnel walk quickly but do not run, specifically so that supervisors can maintain visual accountability throughout the entire evacuation sequence. 11 men died on April 20, 2010. The industry's response was to make sure the evacuation of the surviving 115 would never again be left to improvisation. The alarm sounds. It doesn't matter whether you've been offshore for 2 weeks or 20 years, the physiological response is identical. Adrenaline spikes within seconds, tunnel vision narrows your field of awareness, your heart rate climbs, and every animal instinct encoded in your nervous system over millions of years of evolution screams one single word: run. This is the fight or flight response colliding head-on with a trained procedure, and the procedure has to win, every time. Without exception. Because the fight or flight response was designed for open terrain, not for steel-grated walkways with 50-foot drops on either side and pressure vessels at every corner. This decision seemed small at the time. It wasn't. The transition from panic to protocol is not natural. It is drilled, repeated, and reinforced across every muster drill, every toolbox talk, and every safety briefing until the behavior becomes reflex. Until walking in an emergency is not a choice you make consciously, but a response your body executes before your fear can override it. Experienced offshore hands describe the moment in remarkably consistent terms. You feel the urge, you acknowledge it, and you walk anyway. That's the discipline. That's the gap between a worker who has internalized the culture and one who hasn't. The acknowledgement of the fear without surrendering to it is the entire psychological game. And the stakes of losing that game extend far beyond the individual. Panic is contagious offshore. One person sprinting triggers the people around them. Their pace accelerates. Situational awareness collapses across the group. Bottlenecks form at stairwells and lifeboat stations. Falls happen. And what began as a manageable emergency evacuation becomes a secondary mass casualty event caused not by the original incident, but by the human response to it. The alarm is the trigger, The walk is the answer. Every worker on every offshore platform participates in muster drills. Every hitch, no exceptions. That's not a typo, by the way. Visitors, contractors, new starters, senior supervisors, everyone musters. The drill isn't a formality. It is the mechanism by which the walk becomes muscle memory rather than a rule you have to consciously recall while smoke is filling a corridor. Emergency response plans are engineered and timed around walking pace. The standard is 2 to 3 minutes from any work area on the platform to the assigned muster station, moving at a controlled walk. That timing is not arbitrary. It is calculated based on the actual distances, the actual stairwell widths, and the actual number of personnel who need to move through any given choke point simultaneously. Running would gain you seconds. It would cost you the structural integrity of the entire evacuation. Escape route signage, emergency lighting, and the physical layout of walkways and stairwells are all designed for walking pace. The width of a stairwell on an offshore platform is not designed for 2 people running side by side. It is designed for 1 person walking, with enough clearance for a second to pass if necessary. The infrastructure itself enforces the rule. Drills are actively debriefed. Supervisors note who hesitated at a junction, who bunched up at a stairwell entrance, who walked past their designated muster station. Every deviation is corrected in the debrief, logged, and retested in the next drill. Step Change in Safety, the industry collaborative body that emerged directly from the post-Piper Alpha reform era, has driven industry-wide standardization of these drills across operators and contractors, making disciplined movement a cultural baseline rather than a company-specific quirk. But this wasn't just about step change anymore. The entire global offshore industry, from the North Sea to the Gulf of Mexico to Southeast Asian deepwater operations, had adopted the same standard. The real question is what happened behind closed doors, in the debrief rooms, in the safety meetings, in the quiet conversations between experienced hands after a real alarm. Because the accounts that emerge from those spaces are remarkably consistent, and they carry a weight that no regulation can fully capture. Survivors and safety leaders who have lived through real offshore emergency alarms describe the same moment in almost identical terms. The alarm sounds, the instinct fires, and then there is a conscious, deliberate choice to slow down when every nerve ending is screaming to accelerate. That choice is not made in a vacuum. It is made because the drill has been run enough times that the body knows what to do even when the mind is flooded with adrenaline. What those same survivors emphasize, consistently, is that the rule protects not just the individual worker, but the person directly behind them. The wet patch you just stepped over carefully is invisible to the man following 3 feet behind you. The low-hanging pipe you ducked under is at exactly the wrong height for someone running without looking up. Your controlled movement is a form of protection extended to every person in your wake. Bottlenecks at stairwells and lifeboat stations are where secondary injuries cluster during real evacuations. The data from post-incident analysis, from Deepwater Horizon, from smaller offshore incidents across the North Sea and Gulf of Mexico, consistently points to the same choke points. Walking prevents the pileup. It keeps the flow of people moving through those choke points at a rate the infrastructure can actually handle. Supervisors need visual accountability throughout an evacuation. A walking line of workers can be counted, identified, and tracked. A running crowd cannot. Every worker who has lived through a real alarm says the same thing. The drill saved them. And the walk is the drill. Picture one person breaking into a run on a narrow offshore walkway during an alarm. Watch what happens in the next 30 seconds. The 2 people nearest to them see the run and interpret it as a signal that the situation is worse than they understood. Their pace accelerates. The 3 people behind those 2 do the same. Within half a minute, a controlled evacuation has fragmented into a crowd moving faster than the infrastructure was designed to handle. One person running triggers a panic cascade. It's not a metaphor, it's a documented behavioral pattern in emergency crowd dynamics. Situational awareness collapses as pace increases. People stop reading their environment and start following the person in front of them. On a platform where every surface presents a fall hazard, that collapse in awareness is the mechanism by which a single runner becomes a mass casualty event. A fall on a narrow escape route doesn't just injure one person. The fallen worker is now an obstacle in a corridor that may be less than a meter wide. Everyone behind them stops. They bunch. They push. Secondary falls happen. The route is blocked. Emergency response teams trying to move toward the incident now face a counterflow of panicking workers running directly at them, disorienting, dangerous, and operationally catastrophic. The response team cannot reach the incident. The workers cannot reach the muster station. The entire system seizes. Supervisors lose accountability the moment the group fragments and accelerates. Headcounts at muster stations become impossible when workers arrive in a disordered rush rather than a controlled sequence. The accountability gap that post-Deepwater Horizon analysis identified as a critical failure mode is recreated in real time by a single person who decided the rule didn't apply to them in that moment. The rule exists at the system level. It only works when everyone holds it, every time, without exception. One runner doesn't just endanger themselves. They pull the thread that unravels the entire evacuation structure. Now, the offshore safety culture could have stopped at writing better rules after Piper Alpha. They didn't. The deeper transformation was behavioral, the recognition that a rule printed in a manual and a rule that holds under genuine emergency conditions are separated by years of repeated practice, peer accountability, and cultural identity. New starters are told the rule on day one of induction, before they touch any equipment, before they see their bunk, before they learn where the galley is. The walk, don't run rule is among the first things communicated because it is foundational. Everything else about offshore safety behavior is built on the assumption that workers can regulate their own movement under pressure. Experienced workers self-police. If you see someone running on a platform, even during a drill, even in a non-emergency context, you stop them. You don't report them to a supervisor first. You stop them directly. The supervisor cannot be everywhere. The culture can. The rule has normalized calm under pressure as a professional identity. Offshore workers don't panic, they procedure. That identity is real, it is cultivated deliberately, and it is reinforced every time a veteran worker corrects a newer one without waiting to be asked. Step change in safety, and major operators including Shell, Total Energies, and Equinor have made behavioral safety a measurable key performance indicator, tracked alongside process safety metrics and incident rates. The offshore workplace is statistically safer today than it was in 1987. The UK HSE data confirms it. That improvement is not accidental. It is the accumulated result of every drill run, every peer correction made, every new starter told on day one that the walk is not optional. Everything the offshore industry had built was about to work against complacency, because the moment an industry believes it has solved a problem is precisely the moment it needs to keep drilling the solution. Offshore survival isn't about being fearless. It's about being trained enough that fear doesn't decide. The offshore safety story isn't unique. Drop your biggest question about rig life in the comments.